No declaration was read aloud to the public that morning. No dramatic speech warned Americans that history had just turned a corner. Most people woke up, went to work, read the newspaper, and believed, at least for a few more hours, that the war was still far away. That illusion would not survive the day. For years, the war had been something Americans watched, not something they felt. It lived in headlines from Europe and Asia. It existed in grainy photographs of ruined cities, distant armies, and foreign leaders with unfamiliar names. Germany, Japan, Britain, China. The fighting was brutal, but it was overseas. Across oceans, across cultures, across a psychological distance that made it easier to believe the United States could remain untouched. America had seen wars before, but this one still felt optional. On that day, that belief died. And when it died, the United States didn't just enter a conflict, it entered a world war, whether it was ready or not. For most Americans in the late 1930s and early 1940s, the world was dangerous, but not their problem. The memory of World War I still burned deep. A generation earlier, American soldiers had crossed the Atlantic believing they were fighting the war to end all wars. Instead, they returned to shattered bodies, broken promises, and graves scattered across foreign soil. The lesson many Americans took from that experience was simple. Never again. Never again would the United States be dragged into Europe's endless conflicts. Never again would American blood be spent settling old-world rivalries. Isolation wasn't cowardice, it was wisdom. At least, that's what many believed. But while America looked inward, the world was reorganizing itself violently. In Europe, Adolf Hitler dismantled the post-World War I order piece by piece. First Austria, then Czechoslovakia, then Poland. Each move was tested. Each response was measured. And each time, the world hesitated just long enough for the next invasion to come. In Asia, Japan was already fighting a brutal war in China. Cities burned. Civilians suffered. Empires expanded. This was not a regional conflict. It was a systemic one. But the United States still saw it through distance, geographic and emotional. Inside America, daily life continued. Factories ran. Cars rolled off assembly lines. Families gathered around radios for music and baseball scores, not air raid alerts. The war was discussed, but not felt. Politicians debated neutrality. Newspapers argued policy. Citizens disagreed in diners, classrooms, and living rooms. Some warned that ignoring the conflict would only delay the inevitable. Others insisted that oceans made America untouchable. Both sides believed they were right. And for a while, both sides could still pretend the future was undecided. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood something many Americans did not yet want to accept. This war was not about borders alone. It was about systems, economic systems, political systems, and ultimately, survival. If authoritarian empires controlled Europe and Asia, the United States would not remain unaffected. Trade routes would collapse. Allies would disappear. The balance of power would shift permanently. Roosevelt tried to prepare the country without forcing it. Lend-Lease, military expansion, naval patrols, careful steps, measured language. He spoke of democracy under threat, of freedoms worth defending, but he avoided the word that still terrified the nation most: war. Because the truth was this: America wasn't united. America wasn't ready. And America still didn't fully believe this was its war. Not yet. Then came the moment when distance stopped mattering, when oceans stopped protecting, when theory became reality, when the war stopped being something that happened over there and became something that had arrived here. The day America realized this was not a European war, not an Asian war, but a world war, and America was already part of it. Long before the day America realized this was a world war, the signs were already there. They were not hidden. They were not secret. They were simply ignored or explained away. Because warnings are easy to dismiss when they arrive slowly. In Europe, the war did not begin with chaos. It began with confidence. Germany did not stumble into conflict. It marched into it with planning, speed, and terrifying clarity of purpose. Blitzkrieg shattered Poland in weeks. France fell faster than anyone believed possible. British forces barely escaped across the English Channel. To many Americans, these events were shocking, but still distant. Europe had always fought itself. Empires rose and fell there for centuries. Why should this time be different? But beneath the headlines, something unprecedented was happening. This war was not limited by geography. It ignored tradition. It consumed entire societies. Factories became weapons. Cities became targets. Civilians became part of the battlefield. This was not a war between armies. It was a war between systems of life. And systems once threatened do not stop at borders. Across the Atlantic, President Roosevelt watched the map shrink. Each German advance reduced the distance, not in miles but in options. If Britain fell, America would stand alone against a hostile Europe. If the Atlantic became controlled by enemy navies, American trade would choke. If democracy collapsed overseas, it would not survive untouched at home. Roosevelt understood this was not paranoia. It was mathematics. So the United States began preparing quietly. Not with declarations, not with mobilization speeches, but with policies that slowly bent neutrality without breaking it. Lend-Lease sent weapons instead of soldiers. Naval patrols escorted convoys without calling it war. Factories expanded production just in case. America was arming the world while insisting it was still at peace. To many citizens, this felt like a dangerous game. Why provoke enemies? Why get involved at all? Isolationist voices were loud, organized, and sincere. They argued that oceans were still wide, that Europe's problems were Europe's responsibility, that intervention would only repeat the tragedy of the previous generation. And they were not entirely wrong. America was divided, not between good and evil, but between fear and memory. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, another storm was forming. Japan had been at war long before America noticed. In China, cities were destroyed, populations displaced, resources consumed at a staggering rate. Japan needed oil, steel, rubber, and the United States controlled access to all three. When America imposed embargoes, it believed it was applying pressure. Japan saw it as strangulation. This was the fatal misunderstanding. The United States believed economic pressure could prevent war. Japan believed war was the only way to survive economic pressure. Two logics, one collision, and no room left to compromise. By 1941, the world was already fighting a global war. Only America still argued about definitions. Was this a European conflict? An Asian expansion? A regional crisis? The truth was simpler and more dangerous. This was a connected war, spreading through trade routes, alliances, and resources. And America was already inside it, whether it admitted it or not. Even as diplomats spoke, militaries prepared. Even as headlines debated, fleets repositioned. Even as citizens slept, decisions were being finalized. Not in Washington alone, but in Berlin, in Tokyo. And once those decisions were made, there would be no warning long enough. The illusion that America could choose when to enter this war was fading. The only question left was how it would be forced to understand that choice had already been made for it. That understanding would not come through policy papers, or editorials, or speeches. It would come through fire, and it would come in a single day that erased distance forever. Distance had always been America's greatest defense. 2 oceans, thousands of miles, time long enough to think, debate, and decide. For generations, geography had protected the United States from the violence that consumed other continents. Wars happened elsewhere. Revolutions burned far away. America watched, learned, and waited. That belief shaped everything. And on one quiet morning it ended. The day did not begin with panic. It began like any other. In homes across the country, radios played music. Newspapers landed on doorsteps. Sunday routines unfolded slowly, comfortably, confidently. No one believed the world was about to shrink. No one believed the war was about to arrive. Then the reports began. Confused at first. Fragmented. Almost unbelievable. An attack. American ships. Explosions. Some thought it was an exercise. Others assumed it was exaggerated. America had not been attacked on its own soil in modern history. The idea felt unreal, like fiction bleeding into the morning. But reality does not wait for belief. As confirmation spread, denial collapsed. This was not a skirmish. Not a warning. Not an accident. It was deliberate. Coordinated. Total. And in that moment, something deeper than shock took hold. The understanding that distance, once absolute, no longer mattered. Pearl Harbor was not just a military strike. It was a psychological rupture. It shattered the final argument of isolation. If the war could reach Hawaii, it could reach anywhere. If fleets could cross oceans unseen, oceans were no longer walls. If America could be hit without warning, America was already vulnerable. This was not Europe's war. Not Asia's war. This was everyone's war. The realization did not come all at once. It spread in waves. First disbelief. Then anger. Then clarity. And with clarity came a terrifying truth. The United States had not entered the war late. It had entered at the exact moment it could no longer avoid it. Within hours, the language changed. Not if, but when. Not whether, but how far. Congress no longer debated neutrality. Newspapers no longer questioned involvement. Public opinion swung with unprecedented speed. A nation that had argued for years reached consensus in a single day. This was no longer a question of policy. It was survival. But Pearl Harbor was only the beginning of the realization, not the end. Because almost immediately, the war revealed its true scale. Declarations followed. Alliances activated. Fronts multiplied. Germany declared war on the United States. Italy followed. What had begun as a Pacific shock became an Atlantic certainty. The conflict was no longer regional. It was global, formally and irreversibly. For the first time, Americans saw the war as a single, connected system. Europe and Asia were no longer separate theaters. They were parts of the same struggle. Ships sunk in the Atlantic affected battles in North Africa. Factories in Detroit determined outcomes in the Pacific. Oil, steel, food, labor, everything flowed into the same machine. This was not just a war of armies. It was a war of entire civilizations. The realization hit home quickly. Young men lined up to enlist. Factories shifted overnight. Universities, farms, and offices emptied as the nation reorganized itself around one purpose. America did not slowly transition into a wartime society. It transformed. But beneath the unity, there was fear. Not fear of defeat, fear of scale. Because the question was no longer whether America could fight. The question was whether anyone could survive what this war was becoming. This was a war where cities vanished, where civilians were targets, where technology accelerated killing faster than understanding. And America was now fully inside it. Not watching, not assisting, fighting. The day distance died, innocence followed. The belief that wars could be contained. The hope that oceans could decide fate. The comfort of choosing when history mattered. All gone. In their place stood a single understanding. There was no escape from a world war. Only participation. And as the nation prepared for battles it could barely imagine, another realization quietly took shape, one that would define everything that followed. Winning this war would require more than soldiers, more than weapons, more than courage. It would require the total mobilization of America itself. Once the war reached America, it did not remain at the front lines. It spread inward, into factories, into classrooms, into kitchens, farms, offices, and streets. This was not a war that could be fought by soldiers alone. It demanded an entire nation. Within weeks, the United States began doing something no democracy had ever done at this scale. It reorganized itself for total war. Not slowly, not cautiously, completely. Factories that once built cars stopped building cars. They built tanks, planes, engines. Assembly lines were redesigned overnight. Workers retrained in days. Production targets were raised beyond what anyone believed possible. This was not improvisation. It was industrial transformation. The numbers were staggering. Ships launched faster than the enemy could sink them. Aircraft rolled out in quantities that redefined air power. Weapons flowed across oceans in endless convoys. America did not just join the war. It overwhelmed it with scale. But this transformation came at a cost. Daily life changed almost instantly. Gasoline was rationed. Food was measured. Metal disappeared from shelves. Nothing felt permanent anymore, not even routine. The war had entered every home. Women stepped into roles they had never been allowed to hold. Factories filled with new workers. Skilled labor expanded rapidly. Economic independence grew under the pressure of necessity. This was not framed as revolution. It was framed as duty. But it reshaped the nation in ways that would last long after the war ended. Children collected scrap metal. Families planted victory gardens. Communities organized around shortages and schedules. The line between civilian and soldier blurred. Everyone contributed. Everyone sacrificed. This was the meaning of total war. And yet fear remained. Not of defeat, but of reach. German submarines hunted the Atlantic. Japanese forces advanced across the Pacific. The oceans that once protected America now carried danger both ways. The war had no clear boundary. Even the skies changed. For the first time, Americans understood that future wars would not stop at shorelines. Air power ignored distance. Technology ignored borders. This war was rewriting the rules of conflict itself. Inside the government, decisions became heavier. Every choice carried global consequences. Resources sent to Europe were not available in Asia. Ships lost in the Atlantic could not support Pacific campaigns. The war forced America to think globally, not emotionally but strategically. This was the moment the United States stopped being a regional power. It became a world power, not by choice but by necessity. Victory in one theater depended on endurance in another. Allies mattered. Coordination mattered. This was a single war with many fronts. But total mobilization revealed something else. Power, the ability to shape outcomes far beyond American borders. Factories in the Midwest determined battles in Africa. Shipyards on the coasts decided the fate of island chains thousands of miles away. The world began to move to America's industrial rhythm. Yet beneath the confidence, there was no illusion of ease. Losses mounted. Battles turned brutal. Casualties arrived home in numbers that could not be ignored. The war was no longer abstract. It had names. As America became a weapon, the conflict escalated. More fronts opened. More resources were consumed. More lives were demanded. And as the scale grew, another realization began to form, one darker, more uncertain. This war would not end quickly. It would not end cleanly. And it would not end without changing the world forever. By 1942, it was no longer possible to think of the conflict in fragments. Europe burned. Asia burned. Africa burned. The world had become a single theater of violence, and every decision made in Washington, London, Berlin, or Tokyo rippled across continents. For the American public, the reality was both terrifying and galvanizing. Casualty reports filled the newspapers. Letters from soldiers revealed unimaginable hardship. Families mourned lost sons, husbands, fathers. Yet at the same time, factories operated 24/7. Ships sailed convoys across submarine-infested oceans. Planes took off from every airfield, heading toward distant battlefronts. This was total war. There was no safe space. Every citizen was involved, willingly or not. The global scale of the war introduced complexities never faced before. Victory was no longer about capturing a city or defeating an army. It became a calculation of production, logistics, alliances, and intelligence. Oil, steel, food, and raw materials were as decisive as soldiers on the front lines. A shortage in one corner of the world could tip the balance of battles thousands of miles away. At sea, convoys crossed the Atlantic, constantly under threat from German U-boats. In the Pacific, island chains became blood-soaked stepping stones for amphibious invasions. North Africa and Europe were battlefields for tanks, artillery, and men who had to endure harsh deserts, freezing winters, and endless uncertainty. Every theater was connected. Every victory or loss had immediate consequences elsewhere. America began to understand that winning did not guarantee safety. Even as the Allies advanced, losses were mounting at an alarming rate. The war demanded everything: ingenuity, endurance, sacrifice, and resilience on a scale that no one had ever imagined. This was not a war that could be paused or delayed. Every day mattered. Every shipment mattered. Every life mattered. Yet in the midst of this chaos, Americans discovered their collective power. Communities organized around shared purpose. Factories increased output beyond expectation. Civilians contributed through rationing, volunteering, and ingenuity. Women and minorities entered industries at unprecedented rates, reshaping the workforce permanently. The war was no longer just battles and strategy. It became the measure of human will, coordination, and societal strength. And the moment America realized the war's scale, it also realized something deeper. This was a war not only of weapons, but of time, resource, and endurance. Winning meant more than surviving. It meant reshaping the entire nation and the world itself. Even as victories were achieved on distant battlefields, the losses served as a constant reminder. The war was ruthless, indiscriminate, and relentless. There was no room for hesitation. There was no possibility of half-hearted engagement. America had entered a world that had caught fire, and every decision, every action, every sacrifice now had meaning beyond borders. And in this fiery crucible, the United States began to emerge, not merely as a participant, but as a defining force in the war and the future of the world. By 1943, America's entry into the war had transformed the battlefield, the home front, and the very structure of global power. What had begun as a shock, the attack that erased distance, now became a sustained effort to win decisively. The turning point was not a single battle. It was the accumulation of strategy, production, coordination, and sheer perseverance. In Europe, American soldiers, British allies, and Free French forces began reclaiming territory inch by inch. In the Pacific, island by island, Marines and sailors pushed back the Japanese advance, building momentum with every landing. Victory was measured in miles gained, in supply lines secured, in enemy positions captured, not just in dramatic charges or singular heroism. At home, the nation continued to evolve. Factories produced unprecedented quantities of aircraft, tanks, and ammunition. New technologies emerged, from radar and sonar to improved logistics and planning methods. Women, minorities, and youth permanently reshaped the workforce. Communities adapted to rationing, shortages, and constant mobilization. The United States had become a war machine, but it was also a nation united by purpose, a society entirely oriented toward a single, global objective. The scale of America's contribution reshaped the global balance. No longer could Axis powers ignore the American industrial and military presence. The war that had once seemed distant, abstract, and regional now recognized the United States as a decisive force. The tide was turning, but the lessons extended beyond strategy or weaponry. Americans realized that modern war is total war. It touches every home, every economy, every resource. It requires coordination between military, government, and civilian society. It tests the endurance, ingenuity, and character of a nation. And when the war finally ended in 1945, the legacy was unmistakable. A world reshaped by conflict and diplomacy. A United States transformed into a global power. Lessons about preparation, strategy, and unity that would guide nations for decades. The war had demanded everything, and America had delivered. But the memory of that day, the day distance died, remained etched in the national consciousness. It was the day Americans understood a simple, unshakable truth. Wars are no longer distant. They are global. They are connected. And they will reach anyone who underestimates them. The day America realized this was a world war did more than declare participation. It announced a new era. A world in which isolation could no longer protect. A world in which preparedness, industrial might, and societal unity determined survival. A world forever changed by a single moment when shock became purpose, and purpose became history. That day did not just mark America's entry into World War II. It marked the awakening of a nation to its role on the world stage. And it marked the beginning of a story that would define the 20th century and the centuries to follow.